like now to introduce Professor Alice Jim, who will introduce our guests for tonight.
Thank you, bonsoir. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you the speakers for tonight who will be in conversation with each other. So artist Christopher Kulendran Thomas, who's based in both London and Berlin, and Helen Kaplinski, who is based in London, who is an independent curator there. And I actually met Chris in Berlin earlier this year in March as part of the former West Research Congress. And there I had the opportunity to take in an exhibition he was presenting at the Tuscany-Ziedler Gallery in Berlin that was entitled When Platforms Become Form. And in fact, this is when platitudes, I knew I read that wrong, I need glasses. When platitudes become form, and he'll explain to you where that actually comes from, I'm sure, because it is actually also the exhibition he is now presenting in Canada at Mercer Union in Toronto, and of which he'll be speaking with you, to you about in conversation with Helen. So Chris is born in 1979, and his work is very interested in working through questions of collaboration and exploitation. For example, the idea of structural exploitation, which is associated with the exhibition right now, as a way to deal with the question of the issue of universal human rights. And he is also, his work will also be included in the forthcoming survey at Tate Liverpool titled Art Turning Left, How Values Changed Making from 1789 to 2013, so quite the survey. He's certainly been in a number of exhibitions this year. Now, Chris completed the MFA, his MFA in Fine Arts at Goldsmith, and so that's how he and Helen actually know each other from. Helen is also an alumni of Goldsmith, but in the curatorial program many years ago, right? Helen has been working with the Arts Council collection in London, and she is now working as a curator at the Whitechapel Gallery, where she's continuing to curate a number of exhibitions. And she is also a lecturer in art and design history at the City Literacy Institute, as well as taking a number of curatorial residencies in France, China, and the UK. So it's my great pleasure to welcome them both. Please help me join in welcoming Chris and Helen.
Yeah. Can everyone hear at the back?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay. So thank you for that introduction. As we were saying, the show that Christopher has on at the moment at Mercer Union is When Platitudes Become Form. And this has been shown over the past year at Club Tuscany-Ziedler in Berlin, and also the Centre for Contemporary Art in Tel Aviv. I'm going to ask Christopher to just give a little introduction to his work in terms of the processes of distribution that have gone into producing this particular series, and then I'm going to unpick it a little and invite you all to help me. and so Christopher, we've got here an image of the Mercer Union exhibition, which is all new work that you've produced for the show that's on until the 12th. That's correct, right? And do you want to talk a little bit about the processes of the making of this work?
Yeah. Shall I go through some pictures?
Yeah, that would be great.
So shall I just kind of materially describe what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think that would be...
Hello? Okay. Please tell me if I'm too quiet. So this is these are works from an ongoing enterprise made by purchasing artworks by some of Sri Lanka's foremost young contemporary artists, and then reconfiguring their work for international circulation. This features a charcoal on paper drawing by a young artist called Prageeth Manohansa. He's the same age as me, and he has become successful in the last 3 years in the kind of new context for art in Sri Lanka that is it is called contemporary art, and that's happened in the last, well, it's happened since 2009. In the 3 decades preceding 2009, Sri Lanka was well, a 3-decade civil war ended in 2009 in really the most kind of brutal way that I could have imagined. And the sort of corrupt economic liberalisation that followed what some people are calling a genocide in 2009, that post-war economic liberalisation brought with it the first Western-style white cube commercial galleries representing artists, and with it a context of art that was for the first time called contemporary. So these drawings by Prageeth Manohansa that you're looking at are purchased, and then I've mounted them on these Nike t-shirts framed with this kind of acrylic neon perspex frame.
So, Christopher, can you help to define exactly what you term contemporary art?
So, I mean, what contemporary means in Sri Lanka now is perhaps what contemporary means anywhere anyway, though it typically isn't thought of in this way. Contemporary art in Sri Lanka refers to art influenced by the Western art historical canon. And maybe we can talk more about your question. I think this is an important question. Shall I show a few more pictures?
Yeah.
And then we can come back to exactly this question.
Yeah.
So in the foreground here is a work called Abstract Form by Prageeth Manohansa, which is on paper, and that's been pimped up here on a chipboard shipping crate with plasticine and sound coming from the small plasticine ball that is in the foreground of this picture. In the background of this picture is a painting by another young artist called Pramith Gikiyanaga. Gikiyanaga is Saskia Fernando's newest artist. Here his painting is presented with, behind vertical blinds that kind of obscure the painting, but as you walk past, the painting becomes visible. I'll go back one. So the gallery that represents Pramith Gikianaga and Prageeth Manahansa, Saskia Fernanda Gallery, was the first sort of full-time professional gallery in Sri Lanka that opened in the immediate wake of the brutal end of the civil war there in 2009. And she paved the way for a contemporary art boom in Sri Lanka. And in these kind of 3 years, there's been a sort of like accelerated microcosm of kind of contemporary art establishing itself as the sort of highest benchmark of connoisseurial consumerism in Colombo, now Sri Lanka's capital. This is a 4-screen video based on a sculpture by the Sri Lankan artist Arun Senanayake. Maybe I'll just leave these playing and we can start.
Yeah.
We can talk. So your question about what is contemporary art?
Yeah.
I'm beginning to understand contemporary art as a limited art historical condition, and I think that word contemporary perhaps has been used throughout maybe the last half of the last century to talk about art being made at the time, but I don't think that's what we mean anymore when we say contemporary art. I think contemporary art is actually, the term has mutated into a proper noun, and however aware we may be of it as a proper noun, I think now when you say contemporary art, it actually refers to a particular genre, as opposed to a descriptor of contemporaneity. And I think that's a sneaky kind of genre, in that it's a genre that's presented as if it isn't a genre, or rather it's a sort of genre of genrelessness. And yet, I think it is possible to understand the parameters within which contemporary art is instituted, and perhaps possible to see an underlying logic. So I guess something I'm interested in, like thinking about, and we can talk about this today, is I suppose what the parameters of that genre might be if we think of it as a genre, or what makes contemporary art as opposed to any other possible art. And my hunch, perhaps we can get into later.
Your hunch being
I might get into that now.
the end of contemporary art.
I don't know, I have a hunch that maybe contemporary art has come about as a particular ideological formation through the deregulation of financial services in the West in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and others, and through the collapse of communism as a viable political alternative at the end of that decade. Those structural conditions produced a sort of ideology of non-ideology, and I wonder whether contemporary art could be understood as a function of that kind of ideological formation. Really what I'm saying is that I'm beginning to think of contemporary art as a function for the cultural expression of neoliberalism. And in Sri Lanka, you have this kind of accelerated microcosm of how contemporary art emerges as a function of economic liberalisation.
So I'm wondering a few things. I'm wondering, with your assertion of the end of contemporary art, if there's a kind of mirroring of the Western narrative of an avant-garde where one movement supersedes the next. But I'm also wondering to what extent the usage of contemporary art is the metaphor for the wider collapse of neoliberalism and your use of mimetic forms. You talk about mimetic forms both within.
Can we do one at a time?
Okay, yeah. So the
So we come
first
back to
question
question
about
three.
the
But question 2 was about neoliberalism. And question 1 was about.
So my question, I'll break it down. The first one being about the end of contemporary art as a mirror to the narrative of one movement superseding the next.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is exactly what I'm saying, that the misunderstanding of how that term.
Use this because yours.
Is it working?
Green light's on.
Can you hear him enough at the back?
Am I being quiet?
Maybe you could switch mics. Sorry, back and forth.
Okay. So,
Yeah, that's better.
so I think the confusion is between these two uses of the term contemporary, right? One is the description of art that is made at the time, right? And that's how contemporary with a small c has always been used, right? But when we talk of contemporary art now, I'm saying we are actually referring to a particular genre and a particular art historical condition. So one of the things that characterizes that genre is the idea that it isn't, I mean, a limited art historical condition, right? The idea is that anything can be contemporary art, and the contemporary art can be anything. But I don't think that's true. And I think we actually produce what we sort of produce the more the kind of hidden boundaries of that genre all the time. I think you do that here when you do crits and you sort of set the purpose of contemporary art in a particular way. You also probably talk about stuff that isn't good because that's just propaganda, or that's just advertising, or that's just instrumentalized in some sort of way. And it seems to me that what makes art good in contemporary art terms is its openness to our interpretation. Do you want to get into that?
Mm-hmm. So you talk about the brutal end of the civil war in Sri Lanka opening the doors to development by China and India and others, and this development has occurred in parallel with the development of the contemporary art market and this increased economic liberalisation. So you've talked a little bit about the context of contemporary art through neoliberalism, Could you talk a little bit about how and why this market's arisen? So you've been working with Saskia Fernando, and at the moment she's just working, I believe, through a kind of internal market of collectors. But to what extent do you think she has international aspirations, and what are the characteristics of the particular form of contemporary art that you see arising in parallel with the economic liberalisation of Sri Lanka?
So I mean, you said I've been working with Saskia Fernando. I haven't. I've been buying artworks from Saskia Fernando. I'm just going to play this again. Don't know how to do that. So I guess the basis of the reconfiguring of these works is comes down to what is mimetically in circulation around me or in the context into which I'm working. And I think that's a process both of mimesis and memesis, right?
Yeah, could you
It's
just
a,
unpick that?
it's so yeah, right. So like, I mean, there's the circulation of these memes, like these contemporary art memes, right, amongst my contemporaries. And then there's also the mimicry of.
Can you help us out with the sound? Sorry.
So you mean internet memes? Like LOL?
Yeah, like.
It's a Dawkins type of thing.
Yes. Right. So my translation of what counts as contemporary in one far-flung corner of the globalizing art system into what counts as contemporary in my context, that is based on the sort of memes that are in circulation in my context, right? But there's also a slower process of memesis that has informed the original artworks that I'm purchasing, and that's kind of the flow of these tropes from the Western canon that are then taken up as contemporary art in Sri Lanka now.
So, just going back to my question, because that was interesting in relation to the mimetic, the mimetics that I brought into a previous question, but I think I just asked before as well about the nature of Saskia Fernando as an enterprise, and where you see her aspirations as a gallery. So at the moment she's showing artwork which mimetically reproduces a kind of modernist Western canon of art. And how, or will she, bring these Sri Lankan artists into an international market eventually, do you think? How do you see it developing?
I think we'll be done with contemporary art before she does that. Maybe. But yeah, there's no real international market for the work that that Saskia Fernando or any of her contemporaries in Sri Lanka, any of the new galleries there are showing. I think all of those galleries would like to make an international market for their artists, but that isn't the case yet. It's a regional market, and the specific economic situation there is that Sri Lanka's current president has is engaged in a process of systematic ethnic cleansing in the north and east of the island, occupying that land and selling it off through infrastructure projects to the international backers of his military victory in 2009. The international backers of those war crimes are now rebuilding or developing the north and east of Sri Lanka. These massive infrastructure deals are, well, the backhanders from those deals fund Rajapaksa's kind of tight grip on Sri Lanka, despite the outward projection of supposed democracy. There's a parliament, there are elections, but President Rajapaksa pays the salary of his opposition. So that economic condition that was kind of like on the back of genocide, that's produced an economic boom in Sri Lanka, and the island's economy is now being opened up after 3 decades of civil war, and being liberalised economically. I think that's...
Yeah. So, if Saskia Fernando's artists remain within a limited market in Sri Lanka, at least for the moment, while your work circulates internationally, I'm wondering this asymmetric difference between the Sri Lankan and the global contemporary art market, if it's a process of over-identification, whereby you're exaggerating the difference, exploiting the difference to produce meaning. So this term, over-identification, has been used by Zizek as taking the system more seriously than it takes itself in Plague of Fantasies. And it finds logical paradoxes within the system. So rather than imposing external logic or ethic upon it to reveal its flaws. So in order to sustain themselves, dominant ideologies present benign images to the public that conceal their damaging nature. So, for example, capitalism is presented as the American dream, a system that allows any individual to advance despite the fact that it leaves many excluded from formal systems of power. Likewise, real fascists don't behave like fascists. Repressive governments paint themselves to be open and tolerant in order to keep public support and create mass illusion, and that their politics serves the people. And so over-identification is this method of pushing a system to its extremes in order to expose the concealed undersides of power. Of course, dominant ideologies are good at incorporating criticism, and I want to talk a bit later about critique within art, but over-identification doesn't only serve as an alternative to critique. I think it also gets past the claim to critical distance that we often use in the art world. And over-identification doesn't require one to claim that position outside. Your position as an artist requires a complicity and a collusion with those systems. And the artworks you're producing are shaped by those systems. So if the system's corrupt, I'm wondering to what extent you're willing to be corrupted as an artist, as an individual, or do you discriminate between yourself and the system?
Well, I think I assume as a default my own corruptedness. But before I answer that question, let's not pick on Saskia Fernando, because there are other galleries. I mean, there's a whole bunch of galleries that are both,
featured in this show, right?
She dominates this show because she dominates the art world there. She opened the first kind of contemporary art gallery, and she is now in Colombo, a bit like what Jay Jopling was in London in the 90s. But she's paved the way for a whole bunch of contemporary art galleries and the Colombo Art Biennial and all this stuff. And since 2009, you know, that art world has established itself as the kind of highest benchmark of connoisseurial consumerism, just as contemporary art has in most places. But can I respond to your question about over-identification in a really roundabout way? Because it was quite a roundabout question. Maybe we should talk about why we are here in this country right now. Helen and I are here working on the pilot of a kind of online, offline media platform that's based on Augusto Boal's kind of methodology for forum theatre. Forum theatre is a form of improvisation developed in the 1970s by kind of theatre activist Boal in Brazil, and it's a form, it's a methodology by which communities can where communities can work through kind of structural problems by devising scenes that are then replayed again and again, but with the audience exchanging roles with the originators. So you get all these different ways through a problem. That's a really simplistic description of forum theatre. The results, particularly in South America, have been quite impressive in some instances, where this kind of methodology has been used to organise the workers' movement in Brazil effectively, and a variation called legislative theatre was used by Augusto Boal to successfully rewrite Brazilian laws. But the trouble for this kind of methodology, when applied to what's happening now in the north and east of Sri Lanka, is that oppositional solidarity in the north and east of Sri Lanka has kind of dispersed now throughout the Tamil diaspora, because of the kind of brutal government lockdown there. So, for example, psychological treatment for trauma is prohibited now in Sri Lanka because the army doesn't want the truth of its 2009 genocide to be articulated on any level to anyone. So what Helen and I and our collaborators are developing is a way to do a similar kind of forum theatre-based process, but not live in a room in one go. Rather to do a similar process in a geographically dispersed way, not live but through uploading video. And I mean, we're sort of trying out here the first workshops for what we sort of would like to see develop as a kind of social media form. And the potential for this is to sort of like structurally reorganize communication and oppositional organizing in the Tamil diaspora. Now, this is a kind of evolving, this is a sort of evolution in the overall composition of the ongoing work of When Platitudes Become Form. But its horizon is structural, I suppose, and I think with the gallery-cited work that you've seen pictures of, I think many of the operations of that work and many of its consequences are also sort of structural, or rather not entirely for spectatorship. That's not to say that spectatorship isn't a part of this work, but by doing it, I've kind of come to understand spectatorship as part of the materials of this work, rather than its sole purpose. So, your question about over-identification seems to me to rely on exaggerating something to expose something, to show something, to make a point about something. All of those consequences are for us, for our interpretation. And I'm kind of interested in, I'm interested in those consequences, but I'm interested in all of the other consequences as well. And I think art has always produced its reality. Structurally, art has always had consequences that are institutional, infrastructural, economic, and so on. And art has always been produced by its contiguous structural reality. But we've typically disavowed all of those actual consequences of art in favour of prioritising only art's consequences for the viewer's interpretation. And that kind of, that purpose, like that idea that the purpose of art is spectatorship, or the idea that art is, or contemporary art is for our interpretation. That to me is the sort of like defining characteristic of contemporary art, or like I think that's a sort of way into understanding the hidden boundaries of that genre of genrelessness.
So I think there are a couple of levels that your work's operating at, as well as over-identification. There is the idea of the realia and kind of presenting the world in a sense as part of, I think, the over-identification operation. When you talk about the forum theatre workshops, it makes me think of the tradition of art as a mediative form, and again kind of think about the surface in terms of the meme and the appearance of politics, because the work, I think, will still operate for spectators as well as the participants, and how will that appearance operate is still an issue for me, I think. And the Tamil issue is part of your identity as well, which I also think of as a mimetic form, in the sense that the artist who perhaps uses their cultural identity in order to add value. And it seems to me that you're again working within the mechanisms in your use of identity as a point of difference with others, perhaps.
Can we do one at a
It's
time?
okay.
Yeah, this issue of identity is kind of where this work started for me. And I think you're absolutely right to say that my identity is mobilized in this. I mean, I totally understand myself as part of the materials of this work also. And I am absolutely mobilizing my biography and also mobilizing my sort of role as the artist in this, right? But that's also kind of where this starts for me, in that it began as a way for me to come to terms with the difference between where my family is from and where I am now. And you know, that's just a first-generation immigrant issue, but I didn't want to face up to that in the way that kind of the art of multiculturalism does, by, you know, by sort of projecting an equality. So, I mean, you know, this is even like what Oscar Murillo does, right? You can see on YouTube videos of the Rebel family sort of talking about how it makes them feel that Oscar Murillo is a star, and they can help make him a star because it's a rags to riches story where you know, Oscar Murillo can come from Colombia and you know, make it, and him making it kind of proves that everything's okay. That's sort of how, I mean, that's sort of what they say, and you know, that's essentially the projection of equality in line with the logic of multiculturalism, and that sort of doesn't ring true with my experience of the difference between that context and mine. And so I guess my way of facing up to that was to do it in a way that is appropriately antagonistic or appropriately conflicted, to be truthful to the asymmetry between where I am now and where my family is from.
So I might just ask one more long question and then hand over to everyone else. It's about determinism and potentially reading your work through that. So contemporary art and the liberal market produces a subject who has autonomy of interpretation, as you've laid out. And this liberated consumer and spectator completes the artwork. So the meaning of the artwork is determined by the viewer's interpretation. Do you seek to produce an artwork which is deterministic, so in opposition to this openness of the platitude of contemporary art as we have it now? So in this work, you're controlling the distribution of the artwork from one market to the next, and the logic of that distribution abides by the existing channels of circulation, it delivers the world as a fact to be debated for its ethical dimension, I would argue. So this is a different type of dialogue to the type of free interpretation that we're used to in art schools or in the museum and gallery world. And I'm wondering if you're returning the autonomy of artistic authorship there by framing the artwork deterministically. And by determinism, I mean for everything that happens, there are conditions such that, given those conditions, nothing else could happen. So it's historically, politically been contrasted with the free will of the individual, and I think in this case you could maybe align that free will of the subject with the freely interpreted art object. So one could say you're taking the deterministic approach of the artwork as a subject and object. So in other ways, you're kind of setting in motion a situation that's not deterministic, because you're not always sure where you'll end up with this. And can you talk a little bit about that complex relationship of autonomy as an artist, and where does it begin and end in relation to the system? Is it a case that just if you knew the system well enough, you'd be able to predict the outcome, or do you want to change the system? Because you talk about the end of contemporary art, and perhaps you're claiming this is beyond contemporary art.
That's way too complicated for me to do in one go. So can we break it? Can we break it down?
Autonomy of the artist.
Yeah. Okay. So
what does this mean for the autonomy of the artist? Are you returning it after underscoring the relationship between free interpretation and perhaps the power being on the side of the audience with contemporary art?
So, I am not thinking about this work in terms of, in terms of artistic autonomy. I'm kind of like interested in a sort of earlier trajectory of modernism, perhaps, right? Before Clement Greenberg sort of co-opted the modernist project as a perhaps necessarily elitist form against the threat of fascism, and kind of prioritized artistic autonomy, right? I think if we look back to the earlier stages of the modernist project, if we look at, I don't know, like Soviet constructivism or like Van Dersberg or Bauhaus or any of the stuff, and then, you know, like, I think we can see, yeah, I'm interested in that trajectory that kind of assumes art's instrumentalization, potentially as a sort of, widespread part of daily life. And I think that kind of pre-autonomy understanding of art is, you can kind of trace that through the artist's placement group in the 70s, or like now, perhaps you can understand that in terms of a collective like K-Hole, or like maybe Disc Magazine's ad for Kenzo, or things like this, right? Or like Auto Italia in London.
Those are all quite different projects to my mind in terms
right, but they...
What's the link for you between artist placement group and K-Hole? So it's to do with the relationship with industry, is it, and collectivity? Yeah,
and I think what K-Hole does, I should probably explain.
Yeah.
So K-Hole is a artist's trend report, or, well, it's a commercial trend report published by a group of 5. They don't all identify themselves as artists, but they're represented by a gallery and stuff. And a couple of them identify themselves as artists. And they publish a trend report and do consultancy in branding. And initially that trend report was kind of read mostly by art people, but now it's becoming, it's gaining attention in like the commercial world, and now they're actually involved in commercial relationships, consulting on like product development, on stuff that's actually being made. And this comes from an artistic practice that's kind of based on writing and based on kind of collectively negotiating their own, their own kind of like friendship and dealing with life and, you know, dealing with commerce. And
so is this the idea of the artist as incidental person within industry?
yeah, I mean, that's the artist placement group term for it, yeah.
So that's where it would cross over.
But, you know, I mean, the potential of something like that, or something like Auto Italia in London, which is an artist-run, well, it's kind of most well known as an artist-run TV broadcast, but it's not that watchable unless you're in it, and I guess people watch it because like they recognise people that are in it, and but you know, like like as television, it doesn't work as well as television does. But I think the really important stuff that Auto Italia does is to think through from first principles what it is to be an institution, and so you know that goes down to how to distribute royalties and authorship on big collaborations with a whole bunch of people. And now they are a sort of UK Arts Council funded like institution, but like they've sort of thought it through as an artwork from, you know, they've asked what it means to institute, I guess. I mean, we can turn that off or play it again or whatever. Maybe I'll play it again.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay, thanks.
Is now a good time to open it up, do you think? If anyone's got any questions.
Sure. Oh, and I'd like to say that, you know, there's no need to be polite, because, I mean, I understand this work as a problem. The situation it comes from is problematic, and I think, you know, like I kind of related this work and my part in it as like a big steaming problem, so like, you know, don't hold back.
Can you talk about the actual content of the work that you're buying? Like, is it all the stuff you deem visually nice looking? Like, how do you find, like, are you collaborating with it? Are you destroying it? Are you appropriating it? Like, how do you find you buy the work and that you sort of deal with it once you have it?
I'm definitely not collaborating, and as I said, I have no relationships with these artists, and I don't want to have any relationship with these artists. I'm just dealing with their commercial galleries. I'm buying it on their terms, and my sort of selection of works is based on the market in Sri Lanka. I'm buying what is shit hot there now, and like, I mean, like Prageeth Manahansa is like, he is the shizzle in Colombo. He's young and he's become like a big deal in the last 3 years. So is Pramith Gikiyanaga. I mean, you know, he's newer, but he's you know, he's getting to be a big deal in that regional art market.
Does the gallery know when you're buying the work what you're doing with the work? Is this an open process, or is it how open or closed is that?
It's part of the sale agreement that I can do anything, well, that I can, you know, exhibit it however I want.
Okay.
But even if it wasn't, it would automatically be. I mean, you know, it's what I'm doing isn't an intellectual property issue. There's no copyright violation. I own the work, and you know, I'm free to sell it.
Yeah, but
In selling it, I'm, well, yeah, no, sorry.
are the artists aware?
I
Have you had an interaction with artists at the, yet?
I have no relationship with any of these artists. I've never met them. They haven't contacted me.
Okay.
I haven't contacted them. I've, you know, I only deal with the gallery.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, you kind of hinted at this, but I'm curious, like, the way that you take this work and rather than simply representing it or like recontextualizing it in, a gallery outside of Sri Lanka, you really modify the work by actually making something of your own. And to me, there's like an implicit taste judgment there that this work for you is not up to the standards of contemporary art outside of Sri Lanka. But then also you have to make decisions about what you're going to do to represent it. And I guess my question is, how invested are you actually in the strategies that you use to recreate this work? Like is it completely just an ironic prop to support this more interesting conceptual project, or are you actually trying to make things that in some way you can stand behind formally?
I don't think the project is conceptual, but maybe we can I'll come back to that in a second. I think I don't understand why you made the assumption that you did in thinking that that there's an implication that the Sri Lankan works aren't good enough, because there is no market in Sri Lanka for my work either, right? So yes, I mean it is true that that the places where my work is sold or exhibited, it's true that those places don't provide a context for the Sri Lankan work, right? Yeah, those Sri Lankan works are not, don't work in that context. But it's true the other way around as well. And so I don't think that there's a sort of insinuation of inadequacy. I think there's an incompatibility of contexts, and this work exploits the difference between what counts as contemporary in one part of the world and what counts as contemporary in another part of the world, right? That translation is done with a sensitivity to what's mimetically in circulation around me, but it's also done, it's done to work, and I don't think it would work if it looked like shit, or if it was done if it was done flippantly, and I'm certainly not flippant in my relationship to it, or at least, I don't think this work depends on my sincerity, and that's another thing that maybe we should get into, the issue of sincerity or cynicism or whatever, which is kind of maybe in the background of your question. So maybe someone else can ask me about that and we can get into that. But you talk about it as a prop for a conceptual premise, and I don't think that there is I don't think this work is conceptual, right? In that what it's doing for real. It's not referencing ethnic aesthetics in relation to some other aesthetics or whatever. It's not referencing something. It's made by actually purchasing these things, actually translating them, and actually selling them, and through that, setting something else in motion. This is done with live ammo. It's not like propositional. It isn't a concept. So I don't see it as conceptual. See it as kind of actual.
I'll try to fit the question of sincerity into my question. So you guys are working on a project that is involving the internet and forum theater. And I'm just wondering, maybe both of you want to respond to it, about your thoughts of interesting projects in the future that involve materiality, in contemporary art or in non-contemporary art.
Do you have any utopian ideals, maybe?
That was a question for both of us. Do you,
I
right?
want to think about it a little bit. I don't know if you have anything straight away.
Yeah, I can yak a bit while you think about it. Well, so the materiality of this work, I am understanding in terms of like the object in the gallery, sure, but then also the transactions, the like interventions in these markets, the translations, all of this stuff, right? Including the mobilizing of my own identity, and including like spectatorship becomes a material in this. I think thinking about spectatorship as material as opposed to sole purpose is like a big deal. I think that I think that is a useful way of understanding a lot of like new stuff that's happening in art now. I think I mentioned a few other artists, but like I think thinking about art beyond spectatorship means some sort of exit from the formation of contemporary art, right? And if you want to think more, I can talk a lot about
So I'm working on a project at the moment which is looking at the concept of landscape in relation to on and offline. So this is a show that's going to be opening at Whitechapel in December, and thinking about materiality in relation to early net art and also artists that are working on the internet now, who I think are really foregrounding the importance of materiality as opposed to the kind of ethereal, virtual that we're often sold, this idea of the cloud. And so the idea that the internet is actually a load of, burning coal off the motorway somewhere, storing all our data rather than off an ethereal cloud somewhere is something I've been looking at, especially in relation to ideas of romanticism and nature, and how that those kind of continuing themes of romanticism in opposition to industrialisation have continued today in the branding of the internet, really, as a phenomena. So I've been thinking about materiality in that way quite a bit at the moment. I didn't know if I interrupted you there, if you had more. Does that answer your question?
I have another one. Why don't you have a website?
My favourite way of looking at my work, my favourite way of experiencing my work is like in the wormholes I end up with when Google image searching it. And like, I mean, last week I ended up on like a porn site where it had been reblogged, right? I mean, not like Pornhub or YouPorn or something like that, but like it was young.
Contemporary Art Daily.
Oh yeah, no, there's another porn site, but it was this Tumblr by a 24-year-old artist I don't know, studying at Pratt in New York, who has been like reposting like sexy art and sexy girls, and he's got, I don't know, I kind of like his taste. And yeah, I mean, it's basically a porn site. It's like, but classy porn, more like, fashion-y erotica, right? And yeah, so I don't know. I mean, why do I need a website? Do you think I should have a website? Do you want to make my website?
I don't know how, but it's nice because, I mean, like, we're not all in Toronto right now to look at the Mercer Union show to see these images and how this collection, if you want to call it your collection, your works are growing, and it's kind of like this ongoing thing. So it's interesting to see like how it's progressing, but we can't actually see all of them. So it was nice when I was looking your work up before that I'd seen some of these images, but it was nice to see these newer ones. So
yeah.
I don't know if that.
Should I have a website?
Maybe.
No.
No, there you go.
I mean, like it exists in its circulation.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm sure it'll be up on the Mercer Union website. It's up on the Kraft Tuscany Ziegler website. It's up on whatever. Does it need to be sort of recouped by me as a coherent, body of work or whatever? I mean, that's what I would do if I didn't genuinely believe that what it did was in its circulation. But I think what it does is in its circulation. I think it does its thing when it gets around. And but then, yeah, maybe, I don't know, it might have made your life easier and that's good. So yeah, I'll think about having a website. No, you don't. That's not,
I don't think you should have a
okay.
website.
You don't think that?
No.
Okay.
But you will have
I
a
usually do what
website
Helen
for the
says.
Foreign Theatre project.
Yeah, because that works
yeah,
through
exactly.
a website.
Yeah.
Oh, so there, yeah, when that thing is up and running, right? The actual, the platform for the will be this Forum Theatre thing, right?
Well, if I understood, the show has been shown in different countries.
But different actual physical works,
but
but the same ongoing enterprise.
There's different works, how the people has reacted to the project in different countries is very different or something.
I think they all hate it equally everywhere.
Yeah.
No, actually, I don't know, people have been sort of, I think the contexts are really different, and I'm sort of interested in having these discussions in parts of the world that are sort of implicated through foreign policy, for example, in Sri Lanka's problems now, right? So the show at the Centre for Contemporary Art in Tel Aviv was at one of the sort of institutions in Tel Aviv that is less afraid to I don't know, speak out against their own government and stuff, right? And Israel has been supplying helicopter gunships and military intelligence to President Rajapaksa's regime, also having trained the Tamil Tigers in the past. I think Israel's part in this is sort of live and real now. Canada's been on the opposite side in this, so there's the difference in context, but I don't know what more to say about that. But unless you have a more, no, okay.
Do the Sri Lanka, if you come out to see your exhibitions?
I mean, now at Mercer Union, the gallery is literally 1 block away from the Tamil housing co-op, and there's a huge Tamil population in the immediate vicinity of the gallery. None of whom have been into the gallery, as far, based on me asking them, right? None of them have been into the gallery until this show, right? But that's a specific situation. Is there a Tamil audience for this? I mean, primarily the audience for this is the audience for the institutions in which this work is shown, right? I think that what it does, I mean, actually, I think this is maybe an important issue. I think this has consequences that can't be seen in its entirety from any one point of view. So it has consequences for certain people that have nothing to do with the consequences that it has for other people, right? So our kind of art audience for this is one thing, but then there are other consequences that have actually nothing to do with the context of art and maybe don't need the context of art. And I'm kind of interested in those consequences outside the context of art also. And maybe it's worth mentioning this idea. This goes back to your question about autonomy. This a guy that teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago called David Robbins. He's written a couple of books that you may have seen, Velvet Grind and High Entertainment things. And his kind of proposition, it's not new or anything. Like, it's the artist placement group proposition. It's an early modern proposition, but like, you know, he says it nicely, and it's kind of, his proposition is about reversing the logic of the ready-made. So the ready-made kind of takes non-art into the frame of art and makes it art. But his proposition, and I'm interested in this, is to take artistic operations outside the context of art. Not just outside the gallery, because, you know, public art produces the context of art in public spaces. He's talking about actually taking artistic operations outside the context of art, so it isn't. It doesn't need to be called art. Doing art through non-art processes. So I'm kind of interested in like what would be left of art on a level playing field with like branding or government.
And this is kind of something I'm interested in as well as starting off with politics. You know, all of you guys are probably reading philosophy, politics, all kinds. So starting off with that and ending up with art, or what we call politics, you know, whether it's the reading or the doing. And then what I think Christopher's doing, which is starting with the art and then going for the politics and doing it rather than conceptualising it in some way. But also I just wanted to answer the question about the awareness of the project of the Tamil population, because we've been going to meet various different Tamil diaspora organisations, especially operating out of Toronto, and I was really surprised to see that they'd heard about the project. Right, the Tamil, which ones were they? The Sri Lankans Without Borders. They'd heard about your project, hadn't they? And we weren't sure how, but they said, "You're Christopher." And we know about you when we gave them a copy of the exhibition pamphlet. And so it does seem to have circulated through the community. Did you find out how? No, but it has circulated.
Hello.
It's been mentioned a couple of times that the project isn't conceptual, necessarily doesn't have a conceptual framing. But I wonder, it's a bit of a two-pronged question. How do you see this operating differently than works that fall into a history of like institutional critique?
Yeah.
And how, from what you're saying, do you feel that it functions differently than that?
Yeah.
Maybe not starting with the politics or starting with the art project. And then my second question is, if you're like participating in this new liberal expression, which I think is like a really interesting way of looking at contemporary art, do you think at any point you'll like max out? You know, like, or be like what does it mean to be aware of like the inherent problem within that system and continue to participate? And if you think that you'll ever hit a point where you don't want to participate in that system, if you see the flaws in it?
So I think both of those questions are bound up with the idea of critique. And I don't think this works. I don't get where the critique is. I don't think it's, if it does critique, then that's the sucky bit. And I don't have much confidence in criticality, and not just because it doesn't make grammatical sense. That kind of logic of critique, perhaps derived from conceptual art, right? That logic of conceptual art was almost immediately institutionalized and academicized. That was its point, so that it can sort of be taught and learnt and rehearsed and played out to to create value, and it is exactly that value of critique that is required at the top end of the market, and that's why I do it. If there is critique, if you're seeing critique, then that's right, but it's that. But that's not the important thing. Like, I think institutions require critique to maintain their purpose. And I think it is that logic of critique that prevents art from being able to actually do anything other than for the viewer's interpretation. And critique is for the viewer's interpretation, right? So rather than critiquing, I'm becoming more interested in, like, instituting.
Would you want to say anything about that?
Just that in avoiding critique, I mean, critique is, like you say, subsumed easily. Do you see any other possible potholes that you could fall down if you've managed to avoid critique in your, according to your own rationale?
I think I just said that, like, maybe I haven't avoided critique, but that critique isn't, like, the important thing that is happening, right? Or,
Critique is important.
well, no,
But not.
I think critique is not what this can do,
Okay.
right? I think if you see it in terms of critique, it's lame.
Then critique would mean that your work could be absorbed easily back into the neoliberal logic. That's, I suppose.
That's your second question, but yeah.
So the second question was about complicity.
Yeah, like do you see, like where do you situate yourself within that?
Right. Yeah. Like in the heart of darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I am part of this idea about, like, instituting art's reality as opposed to critiquing it, is because I can't see any viable place outside. So, yes, certainly this is some attempt at a sort of reorganizing in a small way the inside. Right, is that okay using that generalization? Outside, inside, well, yeah. And yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't make any pretense at critical distance outside something to critique it. But yeah, does that make it? Well, your question was like, the question was basically, will I top myself? Because it's.
Or like, yeah, just could you see yourself, because it's a system that you are sort of like reiterating as flawed, and why continue participating?
Right.
in it? Yeah.
But you're seeing it as a sort of stasis or something. But what's interesting for me in this is its trajectory in many ways. So, like, I didn't know when I started doing this what form it would take. So where this is now wasn't predetermined. I exerted some sort of, like, control in setting it in motion, but then ended up following where that went, and it keeps evolving. And the like current evolution of in this overall composition that Helen and I are working on, with, like, I don't know where that will go. It might do nothing, or, like, it might do something really interesting, or it might take on a life of its own even outside the context of of Sri Lanka, right? So there's that trajectory, but also there's the sort of trajectory in the actual work. Like, for example, the pictures that I showed from Mercer Union, a lot of, I mean, some of that work was a series that I think is, you know, is going to be an ongoing series, reconfiguring the work of one artist, Prageeth Manohansa, right? I'm going to start doing that with other artists also, like, you know, persistently reconfiguring their work. And I'm really interested to see what will happen. The more my work is taken up, the more I'll be buying of their work. If my work sort of gets around a lot, then I'll be buying a lot of their work. And, you know, there's a real chance that I could, you know, through this format, through my translation, Prageeth Manohansa could become Saskia Fernandez's biggest selling artist, but, like, not on his own terms. And that like, the more this goes, the more it would intensify the asymmetry of these relationships. And, like, that kind of asymmetry, you know what, this is something kind of core to this work that we haven't talked about, and maybe this is a good time for me to say something about that. You know, this is kind of to do with, like, it's a bit to do with human rights, I'll get there. So, one of the things that contemporary art does is to not discriminate between, like, mediums or contexts. So, I mean, Boris Groys describes this quite effectively in the chapter of art power that's called Equal Aesthetic Rights. And Groys's idea of equal aesthetic rights is, I mean, it's fairly obvious, it's that contemporary art gives equal permission to appropriate across cultures, across histories, across geographies, and also equal permission across mediums or disciplines. And it's in that equal permission, what Groys calls equal aesthetic rights, that Groys sees contemporary art's emancipatory potential. But the trouble with that, for me, is the same as the trouble with human rights. Like, both. I mean, equal aesthetic rights, as Groys says it, like, I mean, that's basically the contemporary art version of human rights. Both are conceptual projections. They're based on a fantasy of equality. And that is inadequate for dealing with the actual structuring of power. So it was actually the United Nations conception of human rights that gave cover for the international community to avoid intervening to prevent genocide in Sri Lanka in 2009. The same thing happened in Rwanda before, right? Human rights were the problem. And so I'm not sure if what's going on with the gallery-cited work here is actually appropriation in contemporary art terms, of, like, appropriating things with equal permission. Because this is, I mean, first of all, it's not referencing something, it's, like, doing it for real. But secondly, it's putting these things together in a way that exploits and intensifies the asymmetry, the asymmetric distribution of power here.
I have a cold, so my voice is very low. But I've been meaning to ask this question from the beginning, which is how in sort of taking a view that you are, it's possible even to have a critical distance from your own production, perhaps is in a way contradicted by the title of your exhibition, right? So you ask how platitudes become form, right? And in a way, it almost prompts us, it's very provocative, this work. It prompts us to ask, in fact, well, what happens when platitudes become form, when we just sort of take it for granted and we don't do anything, there is no inaction about the appropriative techniques or strategies that you are in fact deploying. And I can't help but think, if we go back to form, of course, where you're drawing your title from, is that, in fact, the exhibition that took place exactly about 10 years ago, which asked a similar question, only it asked how latitudes become forms at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And the whole objective for that large group exhibition, subtitled The Art of the Global Age, was about how is art from other latitudes, assuming like from non-European contexts, displayed, right? And made. How is it made and displayed, right? And it really tried to ask, well, in this new age, we're talking like a decade ago, in this new internationalism, this age of internationalism for arts, do actually focusing on these processes and these different practices from other latitudes, is it going to enable contemporary art, the global art world, to actually transcend those national boundaries, all right? But yet at the same time, keep their own local cultural specificities. You know, you might say that one of those mimesis is a cultural specificity to Sri Lankan art, and here you are actually exposing it actually in a way makes very banal or platitizes, or whatever the verb is, platitudes, those latitudes, those attempts to demonstrate a diversity and difference in contemporary art. You're focusing on a very specific region. You're exposing all the structural exploitations that are there. And actually, I find that actually a very powerful statement. And from a curatorial point of view, I'd love to hear, in terms of ethical issues, how one might curate this work into a gallery. So my question with you is, how did you come up with the title, and what are the ethical issues? I've been dying to ask that, so thank you.
Thanks. Shall I do the first? I don't know. I think I've always had retarded titles for my work, and this one. Well, I'm kind of I'm interested in the original exhibition that Harold Zeman curated. In that, like, was that 1969, 1967, 69, right?
Well, that was when.
Yeah.
When latitudes become.
But like in Lehman's original exhibition, there was an attempt to sue him because artists didn't like the way that their work was framed, and back then these debates about curatorial ethics hadn't happened because he was like he's often cited as the first curator to foreground his own authorship, I'm interested in that attempt to sue him. But yeah, the other puns are obvious in that, but that's a what? It's a quadruple entendre or something.
So, your question about the ethics of curating this work. I personally haven't curated one of his gallery-cited exhibitions. I've just been working on the Forum Film platform, but I can talk a little bit anyway about how it might work. And it was mentioned earlier that the work can't be viewed in its entirety, so it has multiple audiences where it operates for a different purpose for those different audiences. So this work that we see in Mercer Union, it's referred to as the gallery-sited work, which I think that it's been shown within commercial galleries, and in this context, Mercer Union is an artist-run centre, which is something quite specific to Canada, I'm learning. But I think it's certainly interesting to consider the difference between the operation, say, within a commercial gallery and within a publicly funded or artist-run space. And I think with Mercer Union, it's made sense to work there for the pilot, for the workshops, because it's artist-run, and in that sense, I think it serves a local community, and it has the local Tamil community there. The works aren't for sale in this context. At Krauper-Toscani Ziedler, they are. So the work, operates on different levels commercially, and then as this kind of ameliorative function for the community, and a non-commercial platform, and then also there will be the online, globally dispersed audience that we'll be working with for the Forum Theatre. So I think it's to consider those various audiences. I think curatorially, that's the ethical position, perhaps.
So I completely disagree.
Okay.
In that I don't think that there is like a big distinction between like commercial galleries and public institutions anymore. I mean, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to think of a public sector in art that is outside the commercial ecology, and are, like I think public institutions mostly act as sort of, in some cases, more prestigious showrooms for commercial galleries. I don't think these are separate ecologies anymore. I think.
Well, the fact that you've got an exhibition at Tate is obviously adding value to when it's shown in a commercial gallery. But
yeah, and even though even though these public institutions don't directly sell art, that's it's part of the same. Yeah, it's part of the same ecology, and So like an institutional show. That's obvious, I guess. But then also increasingly, certainly in Britain, and just as it has been in the United States, it's a bit different here, and it has been like a bit different in, say, Holland, but that's changing now. Like increasingly, public institutions require, increasingly public institution programming is development-led, right? And exhibitions are funded by commercial galleries that represent the artists that are exhibited, or exhibition-specific patrons are arranged, through commercial galleries for public institution shows. So I don't see this big contextual difference.
would you undertake the workshops within a commercial gallery context? Because we've discussed this, so that's, I suppose, why I was thinking of it from that perspective as well.
No, in that respect, yeah. Maybe.
I'm wondering if maybe this would be a good time to maybe continue our conversation in the MFA gallery where there's a reception. Are there any last questions?
Thank you for all the fantastic questions.
There's still another one, so.
Yeah.
One last question.
So, I think about your work, you you kind of denied this fact that there's institutional critique going on, but and you talk about the contemporary and synonymous Western almost art, but you're fitting into a lot of these Western tropes. Like, I think the institutional critique is there. I'm sure people read into that a lot. There's identity politics, and the way you talk about the spectator as kind of integral to the material of the work, there's a little bit of like socially engaged work going on there. But then you talk about the end of the contemporary. Like the contemporary art is kind of coming to an end, but you're fitting pretty well into the genreless period, where actually it's almost like there's a proliferation of genres, which maybe equals genrelessness.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what's beyond, like for you, what do you consider beyond the contemporary? Because this is kind of an avant-garde, like that also is a historical kind of, it's kind of the end of art,
yeah.
Finishing art. So I'm wondering what you consider beyond the contemporary.
I think all of that was a pretty good breakdown, and I suppose the real thing is your final comment. Like, well, no, there are two real things. One goes back to the other question that earlier about complicity, right? And in that respect, yeah, I see this as like not an attempt to stand outside something. I see it as a sort of transitional enterprise. It absolutely requires contemporary art. It feeds off contemporary art. It plays up to contemporary art. I accept all of that, and it's an attempt to contort that into something that might exceed the parameters of contemporary art, and there are a few ways in which I'm interested in that. Right, one is that it isn't this appropriation with equal permission that's going on. I don't know what that is. I don't know if there's a word for that, right? Because that isn't a contemporary art thing, right? But like, that's not just as a proposition. I mean, that's in terms of the reality of what's going on, which is that it's taking as materials the contiguous reality by which art circulates, right? So, I'm becoming really interested in artists that take responsibility for the means by which their work circulates in some way, right? I think we've always made this compromise as artists where we do our art and we hope that that does something for the viewer, and that something that it does for the viewer somehow makes up for the super sucky reality of how it circulates as art. But that compromise seems an obscene one to me now. And so, like maybe there is something that can go somewhere in taking as materials the means by which art is instituted as art. And in this case, that's done to intensify, it's done to not equalize or appropriation on in terms of a projection of equality, but it's done in terms of like manipulating what is institutionally and structurally asymmetrical, right? But then also what's being set in motion is a totally instrumentalized form of cultural production, right? It's a media platform, and maybe that media platform will outgrow the work that it has come from, right? Like, I don't see that as a separate thing. Like, it's sort of part of the same logic, it's part of the same kind of thinking, and I mean, the gallery-cited work has sort of been the way of thinking through this, this way of doing something, right? And like that could outgrow the gallery-cited work, and and have a life of its own, and it could do something. It might do nothing, but like, you know, there's the potential of an exit from that context of art. And yeah, so like in all of those trajectories, I see it as it's a transitional work. It's a traditional thing. I'm sorry?
It seems planned in some way, but yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's like how it's how the plan occurs to me now, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you that plan like a little while ago. Right? Well, nobody has asked about like ethics and stuff. But yeah, okay, cool. So if we're fine with that, then
I think we should continue our conversation over a glass of wine in the MFA gallery. I really want to thank Christopher and Helen for a really inspiring conversation. And
thank you all.